Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second session of the fall 2023 season of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, our webinar centers on a recent book by Andrew Port of Wayne State University entitled Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust, published by Harvard University Press last May. Our discussants this afternoon are Hope Harrison of the George Washington University and Jeffrey Herf of the University of Maryland. I'm Eric Arneson from George Washington University. I chair the seminar with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And for those of you who don't know, the Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association that's focused on new scholarship, and we've been doing this for well over the past decade. A few FYIs before we get started. If you'll take note, the next seminar will take place not this coming Monday, but rather on Thursday, September 28th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when we return to discuss a recent book by Jonathan Sperber entitled The Age of Interconnection, A Global History of the Second Half of the 20th Century. Second, as always, we like to recognize two people who work very hard behind the scenes to make the seminars possible: Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association and Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center. Third, on the logistics front, note that today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll call on as many folks as we can. All right, those are the preliminaries. They're out of the way. You can get the seminar going. Christian, it's all yours.
Thanks, Eric. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our three speakers this afternoon and then moderate the discussion. I'll introduce them in turn. So our keynote speaker, of course, is Andrew Port, professor of history at Wayne State University and former editor-in-chief of the flagship journal Central European History. He earned his BA at Yale University and his PhD from Harvard. He is the author of the book we'll be discussing today, Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust. He's also published Conflict and Stability in the German Democratic Republic, 2007, and he's co-editor with Mary Fulbrook of Becoming East German, Socialist Structures and Sensibilities After Hitler, published in 2013. Andrew, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Zoom room is all yours.
Let me begin by thanking you all for inviting me to do this, Eric and Christian and Jeffrey and Hope. I'm so happy that you've taken the time to read the book and to comment on it. Let me begin by stating the obvious. There are few countries more haunted by the darker aspects of their recent history than Germany. 75 years after the end of World War II, the barbaric crimes committed by the Nazis continue to cast a long shadow at home and abroad, coloring perceptions and self-perceptions of the country and its people. Yet, the story of how Germans managed to put their violent genocidal past behind them in practice and create a stable and prosperous democracy, reluctant to use force and committed to the defense of human rights, that is, I think, an equally important and gripping tale. If the driving question about the years prior to 1945 has long been a disheartening one, where did Germany go wrong, the period since the war presents a different puzzle. How and why did Germany go right? My book, Never Again, tackles these questions in a roundabout way, using German responses to mass murder in other lands to understand how the weight of the past shaped beliefs and influenced actual behavior in the post-war present. I consciously chose this indirect approach, German reactions to foreign genocide, because I hope to present a less stilted picture of German memory work. There are many abstract theories about the nature and significance of collective memory, but to my mind, its true importance lies in its consequences, in its tangible effects on actual attitudes and actions. And that's why I focus in my book less on solemn statements by high-level officials, the usual approach to German Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, and more on the concrete acts that came in response to reports of foreign genocide decades after the final solution. To get at these issues, I specifically look at German responses to the three infamous genocides that took place in Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s. That choice is important, I think, because it lays bare evolving reactions to mass murder during a period of drastic change, from the height of the Cold War, when two German states still existed, to the period following unification, from a time when few Germans showed much interest in the Holocaust, to one when few topics generated as much public attention as the genocide of the European Jews. The precise timing of these genocides is also significant. By chance, a conspicuous spike in interest about the fate of European Jews coincided with the genocide in Cambodia. In fact, the Khmer Rouge were driven from power the very month the American miniseries Holocaust aired on West German television in January 1979. That sensational media event initiated a public fixation on the final solution at precisely the point in time when firsthand details about the carnage in Cambodia began to emerge, and it fundamentally influenced German responses to the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. In turn, it affected how Germans spoke and thought about their own past. And that became especially clear in the mid-1980s during the infamous historians' quarrel, the Historikerstreit, a fierce public debate between German progressives and conservatives about the uniqueness and causes of what now increasingly became known as the Holocaust. There are other good reasons for beginning in the 1970s. This was the decade when global interest in human rights reemerged. It was also when the worldwide flow of refugees reached unprecedented proportions, a development that had a major impact on German responses to foreign genocide. It stimulated humanitarian efforts to relieve mass suffering abroad, but it also at the same time stoked fears about letting in too many foreigners, especially bogus ones, supposedly coming to Germany for purely venal reasons. Few issues have enlivened and politicized public debate of late as much as immigration, and not just in the Federal Republic, as we in the US are well aware. My book draws attention to two contradictory impulses then since the 1970s. Rampant fear, anger, and resentment about overburdening and, quote, excessive foreignization, Überfremdung, and a widespread desire, even compulsion for some, because of Germany's past, to help the less fortunate. A look at German reactions to genocide during the first half of the 1990s takes our story into the period after the Cold War, and thus into a much different geopolitical context. Germany's unexpected unification in 1990 not only marked the end of 4 decades of division, but also transformed the country's international position. The restoration of full sovereignty meant that the country now had greater freedom for maneuver, as well as greater international responsibilities. And its responses to the twin genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda show how this dramatically reconfigured the country's foreign policy, as well as its relationship with a now more distant past. The Federal Republic's changed standing in the world gave rise to a great deal of anguish and hand-wringing at the time. Would unified Germany remain a tamed power, or revert to its dangerous and destructive ways of yore? Had the country truly learned the lessons of its history? The questions of what those lessons even were became a great source of vexed debate in the shadow of genocidal atrocities in the Balkans, where unified Germany faced its most significant challenge abroad since unification, whether to participate in joint military efforts aimed at stopping genocide and other human rights abuses on foreign soil. This confronted Germans with difficult choices that threw into disarray the old post-war consensus on foreign policy and the non-use of force. Even renowned pacifists like Joschka Fischer, a former student radical and future foreign minister, came down on the side of humanitarian intervention. If I have a kind of interesting anecdote about Joschka Fischer related to this book. I won't take up time with it now, but if anybody wants to ask during the Q&A, I'm happy to regale you with that story. My initial interest in German responses to foreign genocide came in the summer of 1992, when I first heard reports that Serbs had set up concentration camps in Bosnia. I was living in Germany at the time, and I vividly recall television images of emaciated men with shaved heads standing behind barbed wire. The images resonated for obvious reasons, and I distinctly recall thinking that this could not be true, that there could not be concentration camps in Europe in 1992. I also recall a great deal of skepticism in Germany as well, as policymakers, public figures, and the media struggled to come up with a proper response. Never again Auschwitz, or never again war. These two slogans encapsulated the harrowing dilemma that many Germans faced after learning about the genocidal atrocities taking place in Bosnia. Should their country, because of its past, stand by and do nothing in response to reports of yet another genocide, this time only a day's drive from Berlin? Or should they participate in international interventions intended to stop the mass slaughter by force? The story of how Germans confronted their past and the concrete consequences that had in response to mass atrocity abroad is a highly relevant story that is arguably as worthy of our interest as the darker topics in modern German history. The focus on Nazism and the Holocaust is understandable, of course, but the attention my book devotes to the admirable and often uplifting actions of Germans from all walks of life offers other countries with difficult pasts, including the United States, what I'd call a masterclass in coming to terms with the more sinister aspects of their own history, especially at a moment when many seem to fear the United States might go the way Germany did in the 1930s. Now, looking to the Germans for inspiration reinforces a widespread tendency to see post-war Western Germany as a success story. Now, there are good reasons for questioning that simple and uplifting narrative, which downplays the less sanguine aspects of Germany's post-war history. I'm thinking of endemic racism and sexism, for example, wealth disparities and environmental degradation. Still, even with those caveats in mind, and even when not measured against the horrible foil of Nazi Germany, the Federal Republic was indeed a success story, a place where Germans effectively put their violent, once genocidal past behind them. Their responses to genocides in foreign lands are an untold aspect of that story. Now, it is true, those responses did not do much to prevent genocide. They were more reactive than active, even when it was taking place in their own backyard in the Balkans. And despite their obligations as an early signatory of the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. But my book doesn't take a normative or prescriptive approach. It's not a j'accuse of Germans for what they should have done in the face of genocide. That, as those of you familiar with Samantha Power's book, I'm drawing a problem from hell, which looks at American responses to genocide. That is more what she does. It's more of a condemnation of American inaction. My book explores instead the parameters of the possible for post-war Germany, given the weight of the past and its own international position before and after 1989. Hardly anyone, least of all the Germans themselves, would have wished or expected East or West Germany to take military action abroad. That would change dramatically after reunification. And that transformation, along with the stormy domestic debates unleashed by the decision to intervene militarily in Bosnia, are all central themes of my book. And I should note, they have great relevance for Germany's evolving position on the conflict today in Ukraine. That no one expected Germans to take military action abroad is an important point because it moves the conversation, I think, beyond moralistic condemnations of inaction, beyond the writing of history as what I like to call politics by other means. For most countries, grand actions involving military force are extremely difficult or simply not possible. And that's why I focus instead on what German officials and citizens could and did do short of sending combat troops, providing various forms of humanitarian assistance, welcoming large numbers of refugees to Germany, exerting diplomatic pressure behind the scenes, and enforcing economic sanctions. Reports of mass atrocities goaded Germans into action, in short, and what they did went far beyond high-sounding speeches meant to abjure or atone for past atrocities. That's significant because it reveals a great deal about German values, mentalities, and lessons learned after 1945. Lessons that should be of interest to Americans searching for effective ways to reckon with the more sordid aspects of their own countries' past. What has struck me repeatedly about German reactions to foreign genocide is that the legacy and lessons of the Third Reich and the Holocaust were not at all clear-cut. The difficult choice between never again Auschwitz and never again war captures just how ambivalent the burden of history could be. In fact, as my book shows again and again, Germany's violent past could be and was used to draw diametrically opposed conclusions about the proper response to reports of foreign genocide. Those who tended to see Germany's hands tied because of its history, who spoke passionately of a duty to nonviolence because of Nazi atrocities, met with equally heartfelt counter-arguments by those who pointed to their country's past as an injunction to act. Quote, "We have a political and moral duty to assist precisely in light of our history," Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel told colleagues in June 1995, just 2 weeks before the genocidal massacre at Srebrenica. He continued, quote, "It was, after all, the Allies who, using military force, by the way, freed us from the Nazi dictatorship." If the Third Reich has taught us anything, it's perhaps that there are no easy answers to these debates. But my book draws attention to something I find just as important. The mass suffering caused by Germans was not necessarily the past that mattered most. The suffering that Germans experienced themselves during and after World War II, their profound sense of victimhood, could be equally motivational. And so could perceptions of political and even economic self-interest. In fact, my book shows how these debates about proper responses to genocide were used over and over to score points against domestic political rivals, with progressives accusing conservatives of supporting humanitarian military intervention in hopes of one day restoring Germany's status as a great power, as a Großmacht. Those on the right responded in kind, asking why the left had remained so silent as Cambodian communists butchered millions. What these debates also show is that most conservatives confronted and took responsibility for Germany's past as seriously as their opponents on the left. That's an important and often overlooked legacy of the progressive political upheavals of the late 1960s, when Nazi crimes became, for almost all Germans, regardless of political outlook, the measure of all things evil. The willingness of conservative Germans to countenance their country's difficult past and draw important lessons from it distinguishes them from many of their counterparts in the United States, who seem disinclined to confront, much less take responsibility for, the history and legacy of American racism. But it should also serve as a sign of encouragement that such efforts need not be politically exclusive or one-sided, nor should remorse. There's perhaps another important lesson here for an American audience: what to avoid when confronting the past. And I'll end with a few thoughts about this. After 2 decades of deafening silence about the Holocaust, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction beginning in the late 1960s, producing an almost obsessive public preoccupation with the dark side of Germany's past. That eventually produced an angry backlash, even on the part of those who can in no way be considered apologists for the Third Reich. I refer to Germans, even on the left, who complain that the political and moralistic use of negative memories about the Nazi past has been used as a high-handed moral cudgel against political enemies. My book shows how those very disputes dominated public discussion about genocide in foreign lands, fueling accusations that foreign atrocities were being used to relativize Germany's own earlier crimes. This played out in the very way that language was used. Heated debates about the appropriateness of referring to Serb prison compounds in Bosnia as concentration camps was just one example of this, one that had eerie reverberations in recent debates in the US about the use of that charged term to describe holding facilities for immigrants on our southern border. The point is that Americans can indeed learn from the Germans about confronting their own checkered past. But those lessons are ambivalent. The need to achieve a balance between too little and too much, to strike a proper tone that doesn't give rise to nasty recriminations and indignant backlash, that is, I think, perhaps the most important lesson the Germans can offer us. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention now.
Thanks, Andrew. Great. Now it's really wonderful to welcome back to Washington History Seminar stalwarts, Hope Harrison and Jeffrey Herf. We'll first hear Hope and her comments and questions for Andrew, and then turn to Jeff. Hope M. Harrison is Professor of History and International Affairs at the George Washington University. She's the author of several books on the Berlin Wall and on how Germany grapples with the past. The prize-winning book, Driving the Soviets Up the Wall, Soviet-East German Relations, 1953 to 1961, published by Princeton in 2003, which was also published as Ulbricht's Mauer in German translation. After the Berlin Wall, Memory and the Making of the New Germany, 1989 to the Present, published by Cambridge in 2019. And the audiobook, The Berlin Wall, A World Divided, part of the Audible Great Courses, produced in 2021. Dr. Harrison serves on the board of 4 museums or memorials in Germany connected with the Cold War and the Berlin Wall. She's received research fellowships from Fulbright, the Nobel Institute in Oslo, the American Academy in Berlin, Harvard, and we're proud to say the Woodrow Wilson Center as well. She has published in the Washington Post, the Frankfurter Allgemeine, Berliner Zeitung. Cold War history has been featured in the media, too many to all name now. Just to say that she also co-chairs the History and Public Policy Programs Advisory Board, and as mentioned, is an alumna of the center. So it's wonderful to welcome her back to the center, to this center forum, and the Washington History Seminar. Hope, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Christian. And Andrew, it's an honor to be here to talk about your important book. As someone interested in contemporary Germany and the culture of memory, I've been waiting for a book like this, a book that examines how the memory of the Holocaust affects German foreign policy. I'm already using it in 2 classes, and I definitely recommend others do that as well. So it's wonderful the way the book straddles the Iron Curtain. In the first case, looking at both how East Germany and West Germany responded to the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia. Doing that, Andrew's book is part of kind of a new tranche of works that look at East and West Germany comparatively instead of only looking at either East Germany or West Germany. But of course, he doesn't just do that. He goes into the post-Cold War, post-unification period, and also looks at the Serbian genocide in Bosnia and the Rwandan genocide of Hutus against Tutsis. For me personally, I think for many who study Germany, Joschka's Fischer role, his role in pushing for a change in German foreign policy because of what was happening in Bosnia, and saying, we've got to put never again war aside. We've got to focus on never again Auschwitz and defend, help to defend the Bosnians against the Serbs was a real turning point, and something that I've long taught about in my classes. But the other cases, the cases of Cambodia and Rwanda, and how Germany approached them, are new to me. So I learned a lot from those. Andrew emphasized in his talk and in the book that, he really he set out to do more than just analyze words, speeches, things like that in how Germany was responding, but to look at German policies, and particularly foreign policies, and how the memory and sort of the legacy of the Holocaust has affected these. So, of course, this book is very timely, coming as Germany is grappling with Russia's war on Ukraine, the biggest crisis in Europe since World War II for Germany, and the biggest crisis, I think, for its understanding of how the Holocaust and Germany's war of aggression more generally in World War II should affect its foreign policy. Therefore, this book provides what I consider really essential background for understanding the current moment. As Andrew describes in the epilogue, Germans on both sides of the argument about the proper policy regarding the war use Germany's past to bolster their argument. Some saying because of the past, Germany should stay out, and in fact should not even be supplying weapons to Ukraine, since that will only prolong the war. The fact that this would make it more likely for Russia to conquer Ukraine is not something these Germans really want to talk about much. Instead, they argue that Germany's proper role should be to bring about peace talks and then contribute to Ukraine's reconstruction. On the other side, different Germans argue that precisely because of Germany's own war of aggression in World War II, it must help defend Ukraine against Russia's imperialistic war of aggression. Andrew relies on an impressive source base for his book, having used German Federal Party and media archives, as well as interviews in person or in correspondence with nearly 50 German diplomats, journalists, and activists. And of course, he also makes use of a wide range of secondary sources. He makes the case for the need to understand not just what the Germans have gotten right about grappling with a difficult past, but also where their approach has been less successful, such as German expressions of other forms of racism beyond anti-Semitism. And the pushback in Germany about what some in the far right, AfD, the Alternative for Germany, have called Germany's cult of shame. I really commend Andrew for not pushing his conclusions too far. He's quite balanced in assessing how the memory of the Holocaust has affected German actions and foreign policy, but also how it has not affected policies. As he points out, many Germans talk about their duty to help stop other genocides and do some limited things, but they don't generally act quickly or strongly enough to actually stop those genocides, which is, of course, much harder. So I'm happy to now move on to my questions and engage in a little bit of a dialogue with you, Andrew, before turning it over to Jeffrey Herf. So my first question is, how much do you think there is a separation or needs to be a separation in German discourse between what the Germans did specifically in the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews, versus more generally the war of aggression they launched in World War II? And how much does that distinction matter to German policies? The first focus, the Holocaust, of course, leads to the never again Auschwitz warning and the need to protect those being bullied by bigger, stronger powers. But the second focus, the German invasions of World War II, leads to the never again war directive. One could argue that among the broad populace, the never again war side is dominated and kind of still does with Russia's war in Ukraine. Public opinion polls still show that a majority of Germans think Germany isn't doing enough on the diplomatic front to try to bring about peace. And more than a third of the population thinks that Germany is providing too much military aid to Ukraine. One could say Germans are actually more anti-military than they are anti-racist. Again, polls show, high numbers of Germans with racist views and high numbers of people with an immigrant background who've been victims of racism. So how much do you think this distinction between the Holocaust and more generally what Germans did with the war of aggression in World War II, how relevant is that to understanding German policies?
Hope, thank you for that. It's funny you asked that question because I was thinking about and writing about just this last night. I'm giving a paper at the German Studies Association in a few weeks looking at never again in Ukraine. I'm essentially going to expand on the epilogue. But what's very interesting is that, yes, Germany's past, its Nazi past, certainly plays a role in these debates, not in the way that it did in Bosnia, and I can talk about that, and I will talk about that in a second. But more that Germans are so focused on the Holocaust that any kind of atrocities that don't reach that level are ignored. And another point I've seen made several times now in the news and elsewhere is that there are these blank spots in German memory about World War II, that there seems to be a tendency to equate, or Tim Snyder has said this, to conflate Russia and the Soviet Union and to ignore or not talk about what had happened in Ukraine and Belarus as well, where the Holocaust by bullets took place. I think that's a fair. I think it's a fair criticism. I'm not sure that is what's driving the hesitancy on the part of many Germans to get more involved there militarily. Your first guest last week, Timothy Gartnash, has come up. Well, actually, it's not his. He took it from a friend, a Ukrainian friend. He refers to this hesitancy not to follow through on promises as Schultzing, right? A play on the right, or making a verb of the name of the current chancellor. I don't think that has to do with some sort of blind spots about what happened in Eastern Europe during World War II. I think there's a real sense of an obligation there to help in some way. The question is how. And I don't want to go on and on and on. So I'll just finish with one point. I found this never again Auschwitz, never again war controversy or debate or discussion in a sense superfluous, because it was no one was ever talking about the Germans going to war. No one was talking about the Germans, marching toward Moscow or marching to Belgrade to stop the Bosnians. They were, going to send weapons to help a group of people that was being attacked. And they had every right under Article 51 of the UN Charter to do that. So in a sense, I find the debate, I don't want to say silly, but I don't really see these as opposite poles. But there you have it. That's where the arguments have been. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't. I agree with you, but it doesn't. Never again war. I think that's a shorthand for saying Germans should not be using their military outside of Germany, basically.
I think that's how some interpret it. Yes, those who argue the Germans should not be sending tanks that can be used by Ukrainians to roll against Russians because of what happened in World War II. I understand that. And I certainly understand the sentiment of never again war. But I have to say, what I find interesting, and I mentioned this in the epilogue, you might recall, the debates this time, everyone is screaming never again war. I came up with a whole list of all the unions, pacifist groups, Scholz, Steinmeier at his speech in Warsaw recently. Everyone uses the phrase never again war. Never again Auschwitz is hardly heard this time, but there doesn't seem to be much fear this time that by providing weapons, Germany is striving to become a great power again, that by providing weapons, Germany is going to be somehow dangerous. That is completely missing from the debate this time. And I find that really striking. When Germans today talk about the burden of history and they talk about the Nazi past, they're referring to Putin and Moscow, not about any danger in Germany itself. And that I really find to be an interesting evolution, in a sense that Germans are becoming more at ease with their past, that they now realize that, they really, who knows what's going to happen in 20 or 30 years, but that they don't pose a threat to peace anymore.
Thanks. So my next question has to do with Holocaust education in Germany. Germany has invested massively for decades in education about the Holocaust, really billions of euros, with the hope of educating Germans to be active democratic citizens who understand, cherish, and fight for the dignity of all human beings and for democracy. So when you spoke to people, the interviews you did for this, sort of how much do you think that education played a role in the actions of the people you spoke with?
Right. I mean, when you say education, I assume you mean in the broadest sense of the word, also coverage in the media, the constant frequent public discussion of the Holocaust. It's difficult. It's difficult to answer that. When I conducted all of these interviews, I expected the role of the Holocaust in German memory to have played a role in the decision. I'm talking here about ordinary Germans who went and provided humanitarian assistance. I don't know. It seemed too facile for them to say, yes, I'm doing it to make up for Germany's past. I found evidence of that. Some people who took in Muslim refugees during the Bosnian War when asked why they did that, said that yes, they were trying to make up somehow for what Germany had done in the past. So that existed, but I found more frequently, as important for the motivation, and that is such a difficult thing to get at, right? What really motivates or why they do these things. I found that, yes, the burden of history was important, but not the history that I had originally thought when I began this, meaning the Holocaust. It was very often their own history, what Germans themselves had suffered. So when they talk about bringing in refugees from Indochina in the late 70s, early 80s, later Bosniaks and Tutsis, they very often talk about their own past, the expulsion from the East, their experiences as refugees. To say that, yes, for anyone to have come out in an interview and say, yes, we're doing this because of the burden of the past, it didn't work that way. That, of course, was there. Right, it's kind of the background music in a sense that led to the activities that they engaged in. Certainly, politicians talked about Germany having a responsibility because of past crimes, but I think it's more complex than that.
Yeah, I guess I'll leave that. I was sort of going in another direction with that, but I'll leave that because your comment got into my third question, which is about the process of you researching and writing your book and how you thought about the conclusions. And you already hinted, and maybe you don't have anything else to say about it, but when you started, I was wondering, what did you think you would find about the influence of the Holocaust on German policy regarding genocide, and what surprised you along the way? So,
yeah, it's an excellent question. I guess I expected two things. One, that memories of the Holocaust would have been the decisive factor in responses to genocides elsewhere. I found the East German case probably more interesting than the West German, because when the East Germans talked about what had just transpired in Cambodia, the question that came to mind was, they didn't think of what had happened in Germany and saw it through that prism, but rather, how is it possible for communists to have committed such atrocities? The other question, or the other finding I kind of expected to find but didn't, was the use of these other genocides to somehow relativize past German crimes. And that I did not see. As you know from the book, there are certainly hints of that, the way language is used, right? Describing these other genocides as using superlatives, the worst in history. And you read that, German writing that, what happened in Cambodia is unimaginable. The worst crime in humanity. I always wonder, what are they doing? What are they thinking when they say or write things like that? And for some, it might have been some sort of subconscious relativization of the Holocaust. I think, though, that extreme use of language, also invoking the Holocaust to say that there are comparisons to concentration camps in Bosnia and what had happened in the 30s and 40s. I think that was done primarily for political purposes in the sense of encouraging others and the government to take the kind of measures that they wanted. In other words, greater humanitarian efforts, perhaps even military intervention.
Thank you. Thank you, Hope.
Can I just finish with two sentences?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Andrew, you're finding that it was their own memories of their own suffering that sort of influenced them more, really meshes with one of the conclusions of my own book about German memory of the wall. When I spoke and read about, for example, East Germans who had fled to West Germany, many of them with the 2015 refugee crisis, where over 1 million refugees from Syria and elsewhere entered Germany, many of them said, I knew what it was like. And I had German. I was, I didn't have to worry about learning a new language, but I was in, effectively a different country. And I feel for these people. And so I want to help these people now because I know how hard it is to be a refugee. So that really jived.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Let me bring in our other commentator now who's been patiently waiting to give his remarks and questions. Jeffrey Herv, Distinguished University Professor Emeritus in the Department of History at the University of Maryland, College Park, where he taught modern, especially modern German history. His recent publications include Israel's Moment, International Support for and Opposition to the Establishment of the Jewish State, 1945 to 1949, Cambridge, published just last year. We featured him and the book in our Washington History Seminar series. Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany and the West German Radical Left, 1967 to 1989, Cambridge, 2016. Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, Yale University Press, 2009. The Jewish Enemy, Nazi Propaganda during World War II and the Holocaust, published by Harvard in 2006. And Divided Memory, the Nazi Past in the Two Germanys, Harvard University Press, 1997, among several other book publications that I won't go into here now, just to say that his essay collection, Three Faces of Anti-Semitism, Right, Left, and Islamist, is forthcoming with Routledge Publishers in early 2024. He has published essays on contemporary history and politics in the American Interest, American Purpose, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, History News Network, the National Interest, you name it. We're delighted to have him back. He's an alumnus of the center as well. And as I said earlier, a frequent participant in the Washington History Seminar. Jeff, it's wonderful to have you back. The Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Hope, for your comments. And congratulations, Andrew, for this fine book. As both Andrew and Hope have described to the listeners, themes of the book, there I can skip some things and focus on others. I want to address Andrew's historian's craft, which is considerable, as one would expect from the former editor-in-chief of Central European History. Never again examines voices from across the political spectrum in Germany, from the CDU to the Greens, from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Die Welt to Die Tageszeitung and the Frankfurter Rundschau. He examines the pages of Neues Deutschland very well, so the reader of the book will get a good overview of the public sphere in Germany as it engaged with these issues. The main thesis of the book, in my view, is that there was a change that took place from the 1970s to the 1990s, in which a growing sentiment within the West German political and opinion-shaping establishment drew the conclusion that the memory of Nazi aggression and mass murder did not necessarily mean never again war, but that never again Auschwitz placed a special responsibility on the German government to try to stop genocides in the present. And this change, let's call it the Port thesis, called into question a long-standing impulse of reticence, keeping a low international profile, focusing on business alone, and even pacifism. The results of Andrew's findings constitute then a riposte a challenge, a rejection to recent, quote, post-colonial, unquote, antagonists of the tradition of Aufarbeiter der Vergangenheit, the reckoning with the Nazi past, who have claimed in Historischer Streit 2.0 that this tradition, which was focused on the Holocaust, stood in the way or stands in the way of responding to gross human rights violations in the past and the present when they afflict people who are not Jews. And that somehow the Holocaust serves, therefore, as a demand for special privileges and indifference toward the suffering of others. Now, the evidence that Port offers is that those who spoke out first and most eloquently and emphatically about the need for a German response to episodes of mass murder in Cambodia, the Balkans, and Rwanda were generally people who placed themselves very much in the tradition of reckoning with the Nazi past, including the Holocaust. For example, Stefan Schwarz, then a young conservative CDU politician, offered graphic details of Serb atrocities that evoked comparisons to the Holocaust in his very first speech in the Bundestag. Prima Duva, a veteran member of the SPD in the Bundestag, and a prominent publicist in the publishing world, evoked comparisons to the Holocaust. It lost many members of his family in the Holocaust. And Duva denounced Serb perpetrators of a genocide against Muslims and urged that these perpetrators be brought to justice before the International Tribunal. And Port offers wonderful descriptions of the human rights activist Robert Neudeck, the television journalist Maria von Belzer, whose 1992 program on mass rapes offered Muslim women the opportunity to speak in person on camera, and then the reporting by very fine West German journalists. And I think one of the aspects of the book that I appreciated was his understanding of and respect for the work of journalists such as Peter Scholl-Latour, Michael Sontheimer, and an iconoclastic East German reporter named Rolf Dach, who had the chutzpah to confirm reports that the Khmer Rouge was actually engaged in mass murder at a time when the East German government was denouncing that as a bunch of imperialist propaganda. A particularly valuable aspect of the work that will endear the book to Andrew's fellow historians is his very skilled examination of the records of the debates, the committee hearings, and the inquiries of the German parliament, the Bundestag. The Bundestag website is powerful but complex. It's not easy to use, but Port has mastered the research tools of its online of the online system, and again demonstrates that often very important evidence is readily available in the public sphere if a historian has the skill and the patience to learn how to consult the relevant print and now online files of the Bundestag. So the historians who are listening in on this program, pay attention to his work on the Bundestag. It offers very promising lessons about doing the work of contemporary history, at least with those tools. And he finds key debates, follows interventions of important participants. For example, in 1995, when the Bundestag was debating whether or not German armed forces should join the United Nations Rapid Reaction Forces in the Balkans, 3/4 of the speakers in the parliament referred to German history and the lessons that it had for the present and the foreign. Now, that simple sentence took a lot of research and a lot of work. Again, Andrew's fellow historians will appreciate it. People drew vastly different lessons in order to arrive at diametrically opposed arguments about military entanglements abroad. And he quotes Klaus Kinkel and Maria Luisa Beck of the Green Party, both of whom noted that Nazi Germany was defeated by armed force. But the diametrically opposed arguments, I think the thrust of the book is to suggest that one set of arguments, those that were drawing more attention to the need for the role of force to prevent genocide and mass murder, I think that predominates in the book. Here are several issues, whether questions or themes for discussion for Andrew. First, the change that you document, isn't it one primarily about the West German and then the German left? The contrast here with France is instructive. Given the fact that some of the leaders of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia had studied their Marxism-Leninism in seminars in France, liberals and the 1968 generation leftists in France viewed the Cambodian genocide as a gruesome outcome of the Marxist-Leninist Stalinist unity of theory and practice, with Jacobin origins, some of it. In Germany, similar arguments appeared in the pages of Die Welt and the FATS among conservatives. Port's evidence suggested, on the whole, echoing the connections between Marxism-Leninism in theory and mass murder in practice, remained a bridge too far for the German left, at least those voices that Port examines. Memories of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and the attack on Jewish Bolshevism probably made such blunt anti-communism that became more fashionable in France less likely in the German context. Did you think about the contrast with the French, and why do you think that the explicit break with communist or the explicit argument about the link between communist ideology and mass murder, which was a phenomenon in France, did not become one in Germany? Second, you argue that 1995 and the decision to participate in the UN Rapid Reaction Force was a caesura in German politics regarding action in world politics. And you offer evidence of changing rhetoric and many noble deeds. But as Maria Louisa Beck put it, one needs soldiers to stop crimes, and the caesura was modest. In the Balkans, only hundreds of miles away, it was the United States, as you note, and you described this well, and President Clinton, who had the will and the means to put an end to Serbian aggression and crime. The habits of keeping a very low international profile and low defense spending after the end of the Cold War persisted for several decades after the apparent caesura of 95. And from then until 2022, the German government refused to increase spending on defense to 2% of its gross national product. And it did a lot of business with Putin both before and after his invasion of Crimea. So my question to you, Andrew, is the term caesura or turning point when applied to the events in Never Again an overstatement? Was this a change? But how deep was this change in the 4-decade-long consensus of reticence and quasi-pacifism? It took the shock of Putin and Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, not the invasion of Crimea in 2014, to fracture that consensus. Third, you have accomplished a great deal in Never Again, and the book is valuable in itself. But you don't address Germany's response to Iran's threats to destroy the state of Israel, possibly with nuclear weapons. And I would like to see more discussion of that issue. Perhaps it can be briefly addressed in a preface to the paperback edition. In my view, this is the single most important case to assess how the reckoning with the Nazi past influences German policy. In Germany, Matthias Kunzel, Stefan Grijat, and Richard Herziger, among others, have written extensively about the issue and about German economic relations with Iran that persisted even as Iran continued its efforts to get the bomb. The person who you quote you quote several people who stress the role of the International Criminal Court, but as I recall in the book, there was no one who urged that Iranian leaders be indicted for violating the incitement clause of the UN Genocide Convention for the statements they made. Chancellor Merkel's impressive 2008 speech to the Knesset, in which she referred to a special German responsibility to come to the defense of Israel, suggested a similar reading of the implications of the tradition of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. So there's more to be done. As you mentioned, lessons. I think one point I'd like to make are the taken for granted accomplishments of the 1950s. The 1960s in West Germany was more about Marxism and imperialism and capitalism. It wasn't a great deal about the Holocaust or anti-Semitism. But the accomplishments of the 1950s in West Germany stand out in particular in contrast to the US South after the Civil War. Because I think it was completely plausible that had it not been for the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, that there might have been a Nazi revival, as there was a revival of the Klan and the imposition of Jim Crow and segregation and American racism. So the taken for granted accomplishment of the 50s is the writing of the West German Constitution, the tradition of militant democracy, and the refusal to coalesce with right-wing extremists, and all of which contributed to the defeat of Nazism. And as Daniel Ziblatt and Stefan Levinsky have reminded us in the last week or two, the peaceful transfer of power took place in the 1950s and 1960s as well. And those were all forms of coming to terms with the Nazi past in a mediated way, not directly about discussing Holocaust and genocide. And the last point I would make about refers to a point that Hope raised and you've raised about victimization. Rüdiger Overman, you may recall, wrote a superb book about 20 years ago about German military losses in World War II. 5 million German soldiers died during the Second World War. Every family in Germany was affected. And I think that as much as anything, more than moral concerns about the Holocaust, that as much as anything was a driving force for German pacifism in the post-war period. But congratulations, Andrew. You've made a very important contribution to the discussion of these issues, and I look forward to your responses.
Thanks, Jeff. Andrew, let me, before I give you a chance to respond to Jeff's 3 or 4 points, is to remind our viewers that we invite you to join us, to join this conversation. You can do so by using the raise hand function and get into a queue, and we'll call on you, or to use the Q&A function in the webinar menu and post your question or comment, and then I'll put it to our commentators. So join us, and with that, Andrew.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Those are really great comments and probing questions. You know what it's like, and when you're doing one of these things, you kind of feel like a deer in a headlight. You don't necessarily, follow entirely the questions that were asked. But let me try to briefly respond to each of them. And if I'm not responding to your question, please let me know. I think you're certainly right. I'll start with your last point about the 1950s. Whether or not there would have been a revival of Nazism, who can tell? I've always had sympathy. I think it's very easy to morally condemn the Germans for the amnesties, for sweeping everything under the rug in the 1950s. Norbert Frey and others have described. But I would also argue that, it was probably, again, morally incorrect, probably the right thing to do at the time. If one hadn't done that, I think there would have been a very good chance that there would have been a revival of Nazism. If you hadn't managed somehow to integrate those who had been implicated. Now, you're right. In the introduction to the book, I try to give some background about the evolution of German memory over time. And what I try to argue is that, most of us, the traditional narrative is, well, it all begins with the 68ers. They discovered Nazism and the Holocaust and the terrible things that happened in the 30s and 40s. And that's simply not true. There are precedents already in the 1950s, earlier in the 60s, and I won't go into them. But what I will say is that for all the silence about the Holocaust in the 50s, I write in the book, and I've argued this elsewhere, that almost every public action in the 1950s, in some way, late 40s, 50s, the writing of the Constitution, etc., was a type of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, was an attempt to make sure that never happened again. Did they talk about the Holocaust? No. And I think it's important to differentiate there, because not all of us do that. When we talk about what the Germans have done, when they started dealing with this the darker aspects of their history, the tendency seems, the litmus test is, when did they talk about the Holocaust? But I would argue that that they dealt with their past in other ways that didn't deal exclusively with the Holocaust. Again, I'm not excusing it, but I believe very strongly that, the 40s and 50s in both German states was an attempt to deal with that recent past. Your question about Iran, I see where you're coming from here. I've also, there was a review that appeared in the Times Literary Supplement about the book, which asked why I didn't talk about the Herero and I get that. Of course, there are, or I gave a talk last week where somebody asked, why didn't I talk about Biafra? Of course, I could have talked about or written about many different other atrocities, but in the introduction, I try to make quite clear why I decided to choose these three. I wanted to focus on the period when the Holocaust becomes a topic in the late 70s, to what I do, and this leads to your second question, what I do see as a Caesar as a break in the 1990s. Again, I could have written a different book, but I did try to, and it's also just the way that I work. I'd rather, what is it, the hedgehog and the fox? I'm one of those who I just feel more comfortable digging into one case or area instead of making it broader. But that was a choice. Why do I see it as a Caesar? I get you, and you said that it had a great deal to do. It's more a description of the West German left and them coming around, people like Fischer and others, Marie-Louise Beck, embracing military action. Yeah, I do see that as a major change. That has to do, one, with greater discussion of the Holocaust in the 1980s, right? The debates about Cambodia are pretty devoid of any mention of, it's certainly not as present. There are allusions, certainly, but it's not as present as it is in the later debates. And the second Caesar, the second break, is this willingness now to actually do something, including sending troops. So I see that as a break. I may be misunderstanding your question, but that's where I see a shift over time. Your last question, the contrast with the French, that's a great question. And in fact, I don't know if you recall, but in this one article that I quote from '79, written by the brother-in-law of Klaus Rainer Röhl, the ex-husband of, what is her name?
Ulrike Meinhof.
Ulrike Meinhof. His brother says that, the French left are talking about what's going on there. You could read articles in Nouvel Observateur about by this Francois Ponchat and others, and that kind of discussion is not taking place in Germany. And Jeffrey, I really think it's a wonderful question why the German left was more rigid, because that's what you're suggesting, right? The French leftists were able to put that ideology behind them, and the Germans, and I could mumble out some explanation for it, but I need to think more about that. But I do think it's an excellent point why there is that difference in the reactions between the two. If you have any ideas, that actually, do you have any suspicions about why there might be that different response?
I think that anti-communism in post-war West Germany and the West German left was so associated with the Nazi regime, and then the 1950s amnesties and the mobilization of the Cold War to put confronting Nazism to the side, and anti-communism was so toxic that it was more difficult for the West German leftists there were West German liberals who did that, but I think that was more difficult for them to do that. That's just off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But,
do you think the existence of a communist German state also played a role there? The fact that there was an East, there was no East France.
Well, in the sense that I think that this gets into a whole other discussion
Right.
about the impact of East Germany on West German intellectual and political life, which was a factor. I don't. You mentioned Norbert Frey's fine book about Adenauer and the Nazi past in the 50s, and when I wrote Divided Memory, I was not trying to justify the amnesties at all. Nor did I think that the amnesties were crucial to democratization. But oh goodness, losing my train of thought. But the point I wanted to make was the taken for granted successes of the 50s. Mm-hmm. That there were 8 million members of the Nazi Party in May 8th of 1945. And keeping these people out of power, out of national power, that was a remarkable accomplishment. And for Americans, we're all talking about, reckoning with racism and blah, blah. Well, think about the South after slavery and what a disaster that was.
David Blight's book on race and reunion.
And the Iran thing is the tradition of Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit it's about what was done to the Jews, and so the contemporary significance of that tradition is seen to it. When Adorno said that Auschwitz must never happen again, he wasn't only referring to the fact that the Khmer Rouge should not kill a third of or a fifth of the Cambodian people, but that Germany had a special responsibility, and this extended from Adorno to Adenauer, to see to it that nobody did that again to the Jews.
Sure. I know we have to say questions, but can I just say something about Jeff? Because you say in Divided Memory, I think you make a really important point, which is that the fact that Germans at all dealt with their past, West Germans, in the 1950s was kind of remarkable. They didn't have to. And I found that a very generous, it influenced how I thought about a lot of these things as well. So anyway.
Well, just a sentence, because there are people who have good questions. That was the result of the total unconditional victory over Nazi Germany in the occupation of the country. And most wars do not end that way.
Yes.
So that was the precondition for the tradition that you and I have been and Hope have been examining and discussing. Congratulations.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. We have a few folks waiting to pose questions, so I'll hold off with my own question. And John Martin, you get to ask the first question. John.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you again for this wonderful seminar. It just keeps getting better and better week after week. I just, as an American journalist who served in the U.S. Army in Germany in the 1960s, and later went back when the wall went back down as an independent journalist, I've always wondered how much effect we had as occupiers and allies in getting the Germans to really take blame for the Holocaust and never try to do it again.
I think I'd go back to responding to I begin by reiterating what Jeffrey said, which is that at the end of the day, it was the utter defeat of Germany, the moral and physical defeat, that probably explains more than anything else why never again happened in Germany. Okay, I think that was the point. But as far as I don't think, as far as I know, the Western Allies did not thematize the Holocaust in the 1950s. Yes, during the Nuremberg trial, an important film is shown, where those who were on trial could see, the fruits of their racial insanity. But I don't think that you can. I don't think we owe it to the United States or the Brits or the French for Germans confronting that aspect of their past.
Thank you. Brigitte Powell, could I call on you for your comment or question?
Yes, this is Dr. Powell. How are you guys doing? Let me lower my hand first here. Yeah, Dr. Porter, my research is in the area of intellectual and diplomatic history between the United States and the late Ottomans. And so I'm just curious, in your specific research, and anyone who would like to chime in here, specifically, so how did Germans specifically learn from their lessons of the past? What were the discussions and lessons of German influence in the Armenian genocide? I saw that you mentioned Turkey on pages 125 to 126 in the book. But I'm just curious, more here in modernity, what have you come across in your research pertaining to some form of accountability, or to what extent were they really influenced? I read some authorships from Germany, some German historians have come out with, and I just want to see different viewpoints here.
Well, what I would say is this. What happened to the Hararo Nama, what happened to the Armenians, it's not a topic in any of these debates. What I found most interesting is that the fact that Rwanda had been part of Germany's largest colony is hardly mentioned in any discussion of how to respond to Rwanda. It's occasionally mentioned, but they speak mainly about the Belgian colonizers and the effects that had on that society and how that led to the genocide. Again, I am covering in the book the period from the mid-70s to the mid-90s. If I were writing the book about today, or let me put it a different way, if a genocide in Rwanda were to take place today, I think that the discussion would be much different, because thanks to Jürgen Zimmermann and other historians and researchers in Germany, there's much greater sensibility now and knowledge of these other genocides and other German crimes. But in the 70s to 90s, that was just not an issue yet, at least not a major one.
Thank you. While we bring in Bill Niven for his question, let me ask you a question that Richard Brown posted. Have you found any generational differences in responses across the decades?
Oh, that's generational differences. It's an excellent question, and I don't have a pithy. Unfortunately, I don't have a pithy response to that. The differences that I focused on more pertain to political outlook and East-West German responses. So I'm sure there were, and I'd have to think through it and think through my material, but none really came to mind when writing the book. I will say, though, that generations seem to be playing an extremely important role in the response to Ukraine today, with older Germans, people like Habermas, people who lived through the Cold War, being much more reticent about Germans sending weapons. Not because Habermas and others fear that there's, Germany wants to become a Großmacht again, but rather because of fears of nuclear war, which, that older generation lived through. So I'm sorry, that's not a very good response to your. It's an excellent question about generations. It's a slippery topic, it's slippery too, because I always find it very difficult to make generalizations about people who belong to different age cohorts. But good question. Sorry, I can't give you a better response.
Thank you. Bill Niven, can we bring him into the conversation? Go ahead, Jen.
Sorry, I just had to unmute. Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew, for the talk, and to Jeffrey and Hope for the questions. I just had one or two observations. As far as the 1950s are concerned, I think there's a little bit more going on than one often thinks. I mean, in terms of my own research, at least around Haarland's Jud Zeus, the number of debates and protests on streets outside cinemas about whether one should be showing any films by this man who produced one of the worst anti-Semitic films of all times. And the debates carried on in the press as well, and partly in the courts. So I think there was quite a bit more going on in the 50s than we think. The second point was about the issue of whether the Germans are remembering the Holocaust or whether they're remembering their own victimhood. And Hope made this point about 2015. And I think 2015 is an example where these memories can emerge quite, in a way, quite harmoniously, although we often see Germans as victims and the Holocaust is somehow in opposition to one another, because I think if I remember rightly, Merkel had also been to Heidenau, to an asylum center, which had been the subject of violence. And she said, we must stop this violence, we must resist racism. And she was very much thinking there too of the need to welcome refugees. I think that was also at the back of her mind. And that was definitely in some connection to the Nazi past. And of course, she'd experienced the GDR and the wall. And I think that was also an issue that played into her decision to welcome or to encourage a cultural welcome towards refugees. But I had just one question for Andrew about multi-directional memory. I finally used that term. And I think one or two people have already pointed out that Germany's been reluctant to remember the Herero and the Nama, and there was an Armenian genocide. And it strikes me that these are kind of historical genocides. What you're talking about is Germany's response to the Holocaust in situations where there are current genocides. And I'm wondering if the problem with historical genocides is because they sort of cast this question about whether Germany is prepared to compare the Holocaust with past genocides, whether it be Armenian genocides or the Herero. But I wonder to what extent your book also demonstrates that there was multi-directional memory in Germany to quite an extent.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yes, I mean, I certainly think that there was multi-directional memory, certainly in response to what was going on in Bosnia. I'm really not sure what to make of that. I mean, Rothberg's book has gotten a lot of attention, and rightfully so. To me, in a sense, and I'm going to phrase this as kindly as possible, it seems to me a kind of banal point to say that talking about different atrocities in relation to one another can be a useful exercise. Clearly, it can be. The danger, of course, and this is what worries many people, is that when you make such comparisons, that it leads to some sort of relativization or downplaying of well, in particular, the Holocaust. I didn't see that happening in the three cases that I write about, but yeah, of course, there's multi-directional memory. Yeah, this back and forth going on there. But I have a feeling that there's, well, you're already off. I don't think you can respond to this, but I have a feeling there's a subtext to your question that maybe I'm not picking up on, or maybe in response to people who believe, and this goes back to what Jeffrey said, this idea that, Germans are, because they're so focused on the Holocaust, are deaf and blind to the suffering of other peoples, especially to Muslims. Well, if you look at how Germans welcomed Bosnian Muslims in the 1990s, I mean, really with open arms, no real outbursts of xenophobia, and I talk about that at great length in the book. Those recent arguments that had been made and that Jeffrey alluded to, I just don't think they hold up to scrutiny when you look at how Germans have talked about and responded to these other genocides. Bill, I just wanted to say one other thing about Mackle in 2015. I may be wrong about this, but I remember a really uncomfortable situation for her where she went to I think some sort of Heim, some sort of home for refugees, and a young Syrian girl, I believe, asked her why she was going to be sent back. And I remember Mackle's response. It was really almost heartbreaking the way she responded. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm sure others know this better than I do, but if I'm not mistaken, that was the shift. That might have been, the moment when she became more generous and was more willing to let others, to let these million people come in that year.
Great. I'm afraid we're quickly running out of time. The last question, short question, will go to Katrin Schultheis, and then for a quick response before Eric will bring the session to an end. Katrin?
Yeah, so quickly then, my question has to do with you mentioned at the end of your presentation that there are lessons to be learned here about dealing with the past. And so in that regard, I wonder how much you think the fact that the period that you were concerned with, during that period, people had living memories of the Holocaust, or at least some people had living memories of the Holocaust. Now, of course, just about everyone who has living memories is gone. So how do you think those the incorporating of memory of the Holocaust or the national memory will change when that entire generation of people who have an actual living memory of it has passed?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I would argue that the importance of Holocaust memory is even greater on the part of those Germans who did not experience it or live through it directly. So younger Germans who have been exposed to the debates of the discussions since the 1980s and 1990s. So I suppose the thing that I worry about most is the reaction of younger Germans who, and I noticed this when I first went to Germany in the late 80s, young Germans who say, we're sick and tired of hearing about this past. It's not so much the living memory of it, I think, that is necessarily important, but the way in which it is discussed in Germany. And you get this pushback from people. Martin Vasa is a perfect example. A good leftist, a good progressive like Martin Vasa, who in the late 90s finally says, we're sick and tired of this moral cudgel always being used against us. That, I think, is the greater concern, not whether or not people had actually lived through that or not. I see a question in the chat room about whether we can stay afterwards to hear about my anecdote about Joschka Fischer, but we probably can't if we need to close at 5:30. Although I'm happy to share it with you.
I think you'll get several requests to share that anecdote, but I'm afraid we do have to bring this session to an end.
Could I just say one thing, Christian?
Yes,
one thing,
sure.
very quickly. I see that there are 8 questions and answers in there. If anyone would like to send me an email with their questions, I'm more than happy to respond to them. I'm sorry we didn't get to your questions.
Great. Well, you've already apologized. I should be doing that for not getting to all the questions, but that's a sign of a really great talk and discussion. Andrew, Hope, Jeff, and of course, Eric, thank you so much for this really stimulating session. And I'll turn it over to Eric for final words.
Thank you, Christian, and everyone else. Just remember, please, that our next session is not this coming Monday, but a week from Thursday on September 28th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when we return to explore Jonathan Sperber's recent The Age of Interconnection, a global history of the second half of the 20th century. Thanks, everyone. Till then, good night.